Crash test dummies are refined instruments and crude stand-ins for human beings. They don't have muscles, organs, or the same bones that we do, but their parts mimic our movements and record forces in a test. The more human-like or biofidelic the dummies are, the more they can tell us about what we'd experience in a real crash. It's taken years of injury biomechanics research to create the dummies we use today. And it didn't start with car crashes. To learn a little more about the history and composition of our dummies, Linda and Griff have a few questions for me.
So first, I'd like to know who invented crash test dummies and when?
Sure. It's been a long process, and they've been developed all along the way. But the first crash test dummies that we know about were used back in the military decades and decades ago. And in fact, before we even had crash test dummies, the military was using actual people to understand the human's tolerance to injury. Then they developed these surrogates that they could use in their testing. And then over time, the automotive industry realized that this was going to be an important tool. The modern day dummies that we use today actually were developed in the mid-70s, and that's when they started going into regular use in crash test programs.
Can you describe to me some ways the crash test dummies have changed over time?
Sure. So the original dummies were really just ballasted bodies that were put in cars. They weren't necessarily instrumented. They were supposed to represent the weight and approximate size of a human. We didn't start out with these very sophisticated crash halls with lots of control over the environment and good lighting and good filming and good instrumentation in the dummy. We were really focused on things like, how do we keep the dummy from being ejected? And so these test programs were done where you could get a vehicle up to speed. It may be, out in wide open space, and doing crashes where vehicles are running into each other or a vehicle is running into a wall. And it was a different environment. But since then, we have developed the dummies to be able to take lots of different measurements and develop the properties to make them more human-like in their response. Because an important thing about a dummy is that it responds in the crash environment like a human would. It's a really important thing to remember that dummies are sophisticated tools, but they're not so sophisticated that they're representing all of the very human parts that we have inside. So if you took the front off like you would in an anatomy model, you would see a lot of metal, some vinyl or plastic, a lot of wires, and instrumentation. It looks nothing like what a human looks like in there.
What part of the body is the dummy really focused on in a car crash test?
We want to focus on those things that are most likely to kill somebody. Something like a head injury or a chest injury. And that's not to say we don't look at the other body parts like the legs and the feet, but we're really focused on making sure that the head and the chest are well protected.
Okay.
And is that where the majority of the sensors are, through the head, neck, and chest area?
Yes, that is where we concentrate, and we're measuring all kinds of things like accelerations in the head, forces in the neck. In the chest, we measure acceleration and deflection all the way down through the pelvis.
Does it have anything that looks like a spine or ribs?
Crash test dummies do have a spine. Depending on which dummy you're looking at, you might have a more or less sophisticated spine. They also do have ribs, not exactly like the ribs that we have in our bodies.
And what about the brain? Like, is there anything in that head?
There's instrumentation. There's accelerometers that are measuring both linear acceleration and angular rates.
There aren't bones, like there's nothing to represent a humerus or a femur to look at whether or not the legs or arms would break.
There are bones. They look like big metal rods.
Okay.
And in the lower extremities, in particular, the thigh and the leg, we can take a lot of measurements on those to help us potentially predict injuries to those regions.
Even though your primary focus is the head, neck, torso,
Yep.
you do collect some data.
Yes.
That is just fascinating.
But we're always looking for better ways to measure things on the dummy that then can help us predict whether people will get injured in crashes.